A little bit about Dr. Dornbos, who suffered a bike accident yesterday. Uh, but, well, he can still speak pretty well. So. The title of the class, the course, is Our Food System and Its Impact. Today's session, which I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Today's session will explain how our current food system affects environmental health. A little bit about Dr. Dornbos. He has been a faculty member of the Calvin Biology Department, teaching courses and mentoring graduate students since 2004. He has also worked in crop genetics and agronomy in the agricultural industry in roles such as the global head of seed production field agronomist. That's a mouthful. He is a member of the Iowa State University graduate faculty, where he earned a PhD in crop production. He also holds an MS degree from Ohio State University, and finally a BS degree from Calvin University. He has also authored a book called Your State, S-T-E-A-K, in the World, on which this course is themed. So with that, I'll turn the microphone and the camera over to Dr. David Dornbos.
Thank you, Tom. All right, our food system and its impact on us. What did we talk about last week? Do you remember?
Human health.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So we're going to start with a quiz. And so you have to play along. And I don't really like fill in the blanks, but we're going to do a couple of fill in the blanks. So let's see how you do. And the idea is to recall some of the main themes of what we ended up with last week. So question number one, the DASH dietary pattern is nutritionally rich and calorically poor. Calorically poor. The standard American diet is calorically rich and nutritionally poor. So if you think about nutrition, you can think about this as simply as the colors of the food that you eat. The colors of the food that you eat are antioxidants that plants are producing to prevent damage to their DNA from solar radiation. So plants have natural built-in sunscreen as well. They don't have to apply it like maybe we should today. DASH recommends how many servings of fruits and veggies daily?
7.
At least 7. 7 of just fruit or 7 of just vegetables, or is 7 the sum of the two? It's the sum. Okay, that's a little low. It's 11. So generally you would say in 11 if you're on a fairly high calorie diet. So typically if you're going to consume about 2,000 calories a day, which would be kind of an average American. At my age, I'm probably, if I would exercise less, it would probably be a little less than that. 4 to 5 servings of fruits per day. Medium-sized apple would be like 1 serving. 4 to 5 additional servings of vegetables. And then a question I don't have here, how much grain? How many grains are we supposed to have in our diet according to the DASH dietary pattern? Do you recall? 6 is on the low side, unless you're on lower calorie intake, then it could be okay. 8 to 10, typically 8 to 10, where 1 slice of bread would be like 1 serving. So the servings are relatively small. But I'll specify whole grain and not even whole wheat. So we'll talk a little bit about that maybe the last week. But when we get into labeling law and what food producers can put on labels, there are some nuances that are, well, for me, they're a little frustrating. So when I would buy whole grain bread, I think I'm getting the more healthful kind of grains, but it turns out that's not actually true. You need specifically to have grain in the name, whole grain bread. So the dash recommends how much meat and what types of meat. So fish and chicken, so we're going to emphasize fish and chicken, and very minimal red. So the dietary pattern doesn't say no red meat, but minimal. Six servings where 1 ounce of uncooked meat is considered a serving. So think of like, I don't know, 1/4 of a pound. A quarter pounder is just a little bit too much. But 6 ounces gives you some flexibility. So it turns out the evidence suggests that we don't have to be vegan or vegetarian to maintain health, but it certainly doesn't hurt to be vegan or vegetarian. Eating some meat is okay. You can protect your health while eating some meat, but it should be mostly poultry, fish, and not too much. So then the question is, how much does red meat increase chronic disease? So if you're consuming red meat at the rate that an average American is consuming red meat, which is on the order of like 8 to 9 ounces per day, what risk increase is there of like coronary disease, systemic vascular disease? Do you recall? About 30%. So I don't know if 30% feels like a lot or a little. It turns out the risks of smoking are much greater than 30%. So 30% isn't maybe a huge number, which kind of also maybe I find a little bit almost reassuring that our bodies can handle that. List factors that make ultra-processed foods less healthy. So we're going to talk about how food is produced today, and we're going to focus on corn and soybean, a little bit of wheat, a little bit of cotton, but mostly corn and soybean, which it turns out most processed foods are comprised almost entirely of corn and soybean. So you look at the ingredient label, almost always corn or soy protein are going to be like the top 2 or 3 ingredients in terms of volume of what's in the processed food. And there's some reasons why producers use corn and soybean. So is it corn and soybean that make ultra-processed foods? What is it about ultra-processed foods that make them less healthy? So there are some chemicals, preservatives. So some level of preservatives is probably good because, you know, they're using preservatives so that there aren't fungal contaminants, which could also make us worse. Oh, there's all kinds of different ones. If you look in the, I should have brought some ingredient labels, but if you look at the back of the ingredient labels, and there's sorbitol and all kinds of other alcohols and kinds of chemicals that are in there that are used as preservatives. It is. Well, it's one of them. There's lots. But someone said salt. So salt is clearly a driver. That's one of the concerns. What's another one? So sugar, added sugar. So it's the salt and the sugar that are in those foods that you're not necessarily aware of that you're consuming when you're consuming those products. The whole grain is stripped out. So when you strip the whole grain part out of it, what are you actually losing? What do you not have? It's more of what you don't have than what you have. So there's some nutrients that are stripped out for sure. There's still some nutrients there. Mostly it's carbohydrate. Starch is what they're after. It's fiber. So fiber is the #1 concern. There's a real reason why colon cancer is the problem that it is in the United States, and we just don't get the fiber in our diets that we should be getting. There's actually another factor in there. It could be food dyes, and Kraft actually made a really interesting announcement this past week. They're going to take all the dyes out of their foods.
By when?
I don't know by when exactly, but I think it's down the road another year or so, but apparently it's coming. What else is in processed food that you ought to be aware of, but most people aren't? You're not necessarily aware that it's there. It's fats. It's actually vegetable oils, which are generally healthy, because they're low in saturated fat, and it's unsaturated or polyunsaturated fats that are generally more healthful for your diet. So why is it that having vegetable oils in those foods is bad? It's how much. So at some point, it's no longer about the protectiveness of having polyunsaturated fats, it's the caloric load of how many fats there are. So it's really not a concern about the fatty acids themselves, it's the carbohydrate, or it's the calorie load. All right. You done good. So we can move on. Oh, sure, of course. Oh, I need.
Oh,
Got to speak loudly and clearly into the microphone.
my voice travels pretty well anyway. Where does dairy fit in this?
So dairy, I kind of glossed over it, but dairy is in the DASH dietary pattern. Typically 1 to 2 servings per day are fine. Generally, what they would emphasize, the DASH diet emphasizes is low fat dairy.
I do not like dairy.
How about the fact that I don't like dairy products? Oh, you don't have to eat them. There's. How is the lack of dairy impacting? Probably the lack of dairy is probably not impacting your health in any particular way. So there are not a lot of nutrients necessarily in dairy. It's more calories associated with the fats and the oils.
Drink milk because of the vitamin D.
Okay. So vitamin D could be a concern. Vitamin D, our skin will make it if we're exposed to sunlight. Of course, that's fine this time of year, but during the winter months when we don't have sunlight for months in Western Michigan, especially, your body is not then making enough vitamin D. So milk products don't generally have vitamin D in them, but they're supplemented with vitamin D. So I would say you probably don't need to drink milk to get the vitamin D, but you might want to use a daily multivitamin and get vitamin D that way. So the 2 vitamins that are of concern are vitamin D and vitamin B12. So those are the 2 vitamin groups that are relatively poorly represented in diets without a lot of meat. Yes.
My daughter, who's a nurse practitioner, says that her information says that most seniors don't get enough protein. How would you respond to that? Does the DASH really answer that?
Yeah, the DASH diet does answer that. But if you're after protein, certainly you can use your 6 ounces of meat. And so you're going to get a high concentration of protein in fish and poultry. But certainly on the vegetable side of things, emphasize beans, lentils. There are also some nuts. There's, like a couple tablespoons or so of nuts a day are part of the DASH dietary pattern. So those are all very protein rich foods. And even better, they're high quality proteins. So if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, you'll know that that's where you've got to go to get the proteins in your diet is beans and nuts and that sort of thing. Cool. All right. So impact of the current food production system on environmental health. So I want to start with kind of a bit of a faith perspective today, rather than ending with it. And I want to plant some ideas in your heads and then think about this as kind of a backdrop as we get into the food production system. So John 1 was always an interesting passage to me because John 1 talks about the Word spoke and the Word created. And I always looked at that and I said, it's capital W. Why is the word got a capital W? That suggests it's a proper name. And it is. It's a proper name of the person of Jesus Christ in the Trinity. So it's Jesus Christ who spoke and created. And in Genesis 1, found that it was good. So if you read through the Genesis story, 4 times it says, after not every creation day, but a lot of them, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good, it was good. And then when people were created, Adam and Eve, it is very good. So what does that "it is good" mean? What does that imply? And I think there's a really important principle here for people who are Christians, and that is when God created it in its unadulterated form, before sin had infused the word, God called it good. That implies intrinsic value, that the creation he had made, every element of it, had, by definition, intrinsic value. So we don't think a lot about intrinsic value in our culture. We think more about extrinsic value or instrumental value, the cash, the dollars that we spend on something, or what something is worth in terms of dollars. So that's instrumental value. But Genesis 1, I think importantly, when God said it was good, he implied that there is intrinsic value, just because it is. And so as Christians, we should want to see and enjoy and also honor and try to protect that which God gave value. So Genesis 2:15 is a deceivingly difficult to follow command, because it's actually not one command, it's two. And so Genesis 2:15 says to serve and protect, or another interpretation is to use and take care of. And so this was the command given to Adam and Eve. As we look at this world that God created, that he had given an intrinsic value, and it was humans' responsibility to care for this creation. And so my favorite version is actually to use and take care of. So to use, to me, feels like, yes, we should till fields, we should plant them, we should harvest the food, and we should eat it. And God's got this biological process in place to grow food. And it is up to us if we are actually honored. We're honoring God when we use this system to produce our food. But it also has the word protect. So this world with intrinsic value, our responsibility is to protect its integrity, to protect maybe species from becoming extinct. So that's the two commands: to use it and to take care of it, to serve it and protect it. And so those two commands are connected by a very simple, but it turns out a really important word, the little word "and." So the word "and" is important because we can't do one or the other. We got to do both. It's not an option just to use the resources that God gave us in his creation and then be done with it, and we don't worry about what they look like afterwards. It's our responsibility to use those, I guess, resources in creation, but then also we have to have a mind of protecting them. So part of how this plays out then is in maybe Leviticus 25. So you get into Leviticus and you go, okay, what if Leviticus might apply to us today? Well, it turns out, I think there is some themes in here. Not all of Leviticus maybe applies culturally today as much as it did. But Leviticus 25 has got, I think it's verse 4, even the land is to have its Sabbath rest. Do we ever give land, agricultural land in North America, a Sabbath rest? Winter, but it's not the whole year. And so the idea of a Sabbath rest is it was supposed to be if you read the whole passage, which maybe I'll bring next time, it's to have a year of Sabbath rest. And we don't do that. In fact, if you go into Indiana and Ohio and southern Iowa, we'll double crop. I mean,
They have crop rotation, doesn't that kind of take care of some of these things?
do we have crop rotation? Does
Yeah.
that take care of it? Maybe. I think it does to the degree that we actually do rotate crops. But we don't rotate crops like we used to, and that's a little bit what we're going to map out.
Okay.
So I wonder about that one. There's actually three chapters in there that God is giving instructions about how we are to manage this good creation. And then John 3:16. Anybody here know Stephen Baumler-Prediger? He's a religion prof at Calvin. He pointed something out to me at a conference that I was at, and I was listening to him talk. And he was kind of looking at exegetically at John 3:16, which we all know so well. For God so loved the world that he sent his one and only son. So we all take that kind of, and I am certainly guilty, maybe not you, but I certainly at that point was thinking, God sent Jesus Christ to save me. So I could put in here, so for God so loved Dave Dornbos that he sent his one and only son. But as Stephen pointed out, that's not what he says, actually. For God so loved the world. So yeah, I'm part of that world, and every person is. But actually, the world interprets to cosmos with a K, which correlates to cosmos with a C, which actually comes right back to the whole world that God saw it was good. Soil, water, nutrients, carbon, animals, little piping plovers that we might find on the Lake Michigan shore. That God so loved the entire world, the whole system, that he sent his one and only son. So put those ideas in the back of your head, and we'll forge ahead. So this is where you got to play back. Where does your food come from?
The grocery store.
Can you get a little more specific than that? Because it sounds like my students. So if I ask, so I play this game with my students, and these are like juniors and seniors in college, right? And they'll say from the grocery store, where we can go and we can buy anything of all different colors and types for a huge variety of cultural tastes for actually pretty cheap, really. I mean, it's like for most of us, it's like in America anyway, it's like 4% of our income. Okay, so where does the grocery store get it?
Farms from the earth.
So from the farm.
Farms from the earth.
So do you know what the farmer has to do to produce this food? Do you know what the farmer has to do to produce this food? So this is to ask more specifically, can you describe where your food comes from? Let's just say you buy a Twinkie. Where does the Twinkie come from? What is grown to produce that Twinkie? So there's a lot of corn in there, but it's not only corn.
Yeah.
So there's 32 ingredients.
Yeah.
The 32 ingredients are different ingredients from corn, but also soybean. But if you look at really the list of what's in Twinkies, it's 32 chemicals, and they're almost all different components of corn or soybean. There's a few other things in there, but not much. So there's chemicals, preservatives. Yep. Yeah, you can.
I agree with you.
Yeah, you can define the whole thing as it's a collection of chemicals. How about a carrot? You buy carrots at the grocery store. Where do your carrots come from?
Soil.
Okay, they come out of the soil. I've got carrots growing in the soil right now. I just did the fine weeding down the rows because it's important at this stage. Otherwise they get crowded out. They're not very strong competitors at that young stage. But how do I get my little carrot seedlings? Okay, so I plant my seeds in the ground, and then I have to weed them and nurture them along, maybe water them a little bit. And then how do I get the carrot? Pull them out of the ground, wash them off, and I can eat them. So if you know where your food comes from, can you explain to me then why a bunch of carrots cost less than a box of Twinkies? Because there's 32 different ingredients. So think about this from a Twinkie farmer perspective. I got to plant corn seeds. I got to plant soybean seeds in different fields. I've got to manage both of those fields. I'm going to collect the corn and soybean grain, and then I'm going to send them to different factories to extract out the various chemicals that I'm then going to send to a different factory where I can assemble the recipe and cook these little delectable cakes, which if you take one out of the cellophane wrapper and send it on top of your filing cabinet, will not rot. I ran an experiment like that for 15 years, and that little Twinkie just shrunk and got a little smaller because it dehydrated, but it did not rot. But if I do that with a carrot, the carrot will rot, which ought to be a concern. So if I got to do all that with Twinkies to get a Twinkie, why do carrots cost more than Twinkies? How does that work? How do Twinkies cost less than carrots? When all I got to do is plant a carrot seed and I get a carrot, to get Twinkies, I got to plant corn seeds, soybean seeds, I got to harvest them and do all of the industrial stuff. Okay, so she said farm subsidies. That's on the right track.
Quantity per acre.
It's quantity, a little bit quantity per acre, sure. Although I'm going to challenge that a little later on, but that's going to be next week. Because I was definitely the way I was thinking about it for a decade after coming to Calvin from Industrial ISA. So if we think about the food production system just at that kind of 30,000 foot level, are you satisfied with it?
No. Well, this may not be what you're looking for, but isn't it like 5 corporations control all our food?
Yeah, it depends on what kind of foods we're talking about. We'll definitely get there. But there are relatively few number of big corporations that control big sectors within food industry. Definitely true.
How about transportation costs? We tend to not get local foods.
Yeah, we tend not to get local foods, partly because transportation is possible and it's actually not that expensive. But I'll show you some transportation cost numbers as it relates to greenhouse gases.
We don't.
On the other hand, I like having bananas in the winter months, and we can't grow bananas, or any time of year we can't grow bananas in Michigan. So I think transportation costs, I think there's a value in there that we do want to use. But on the other hand, think about the transportation cost is part of the Twinkies. If you're moving all these ingredients all over the place, and there's probably one Hostess plant in the United States that makes Twinkies, all those Twinkies end up in all the grocery stores. There's a lot of transportation costs. There's soybean corn parts moving all over the place to make those Twinkies.
On some level, we don't go hungry. So you could argue that the food system is quite effective.
Absolutely.
I think 4% of income was spent on food.
Yeah, something like that. I think that's
Relatively low.
yeah, it is. On the other hand, I planted some seeds. The foods that we eat, the Twinkies, do the Twinkies promote chronic disease? Do carrots promote chronic disease? Carrots actually protect from chronic disease. Twinkies promote chronic disease. That's $4.2 trillion of our $5 trillion a year spent in the United States. So yeah, we don't go hungry, but maybe we should go, well, not eat some of those things anyway. So here's an outline. I don't know that I'll get through all of this today. Probably not. We'll get as far as we can get. My hope is to get kind of into 5, and we might carry number 6 into next week. I want to talk about the annual crop production cycle, just a couple of pictures, and really just to remind you at a level that you already know. I want to talk then a little bit about how much food we produce, a little bit to get to your comment, how we got to where we are. So I want you to see the food production system, how it was done when my mom grew up on the farm, when I worked in agriculture, and what it looks like today. So it's evolved very rapidly over the last 40 to 50 years, and it looks very different now than what it did 50, 60 years ago. And at a level, of course, that, I'm sure. How many people here actually grew up on a farm? Anybody? Nobody. Oh, wow. I'm a little bit surprised because, when you were kids, probably 50% of Americans farmed. Do you know what percentage of Americans actually farm as their main source of income today?
we grew our own foods in the summer.
Okay,
So it wasn't a farm, but
yeah. So you have some
But-
exposure. Well, I do the same. I do the same now. And I think many of you do because I know there's a bunch of gardeners in here. Turns out, when you were kids, I'm guessing, estimating, roughly 50% of Americans farmed. And today it's less than 1% of Americans farm. And the average age of the farmer is, I think, about 65, 67. So there's going to continue to be change. And the question is, well, if you don't like this system, what is it about the system that you don't like? I think we got to get specific there. That's the purpose of today. And then the purpose of 2 weeks from now, the fourth session is, if it's going to actually change to something more that you like, what needs to happen? And I have some ideas there that I think maybe will say, well, you would say, well, okay, it's a movement in the right direction, but maybe not like super fast. So there probably needs to be some patience. Of course, this food system's been evolving for like 40, 50 years. I don't think we want to go back to how it was done 40, 50 years ago, but we could go forward differently than the trajectory that we're on. That's essentially where I want to go. So I want to get into environmental impacts of crop production. Certainly, I do want to acknowledge that there has been a movement of sustainable ag for like 30 or 40 years. And so sustainable ag is what most farmers farming today would tell you that they're doing. And I'm acknowledging here that sustainable ag improves sustainability, but I'm going to also argue that it's certainly not sustainable today, even with sustainable ag. And it can't, and there's a paradigm that we're in that we need to challenge. In that environmental impacts of, we'll get into some environmental impacts of meat production specifically. All right, so the annual cycle of producing crops, producing food is another word that we could use as crops, starts typically in the fall. In the fall, in this case, here's an old alfalfa stand. And the old alfalfa stand is being plowed under as kind of a green manure. It will decompose. So you're literally with the moldboard plow taking what's growing on the top and flipping it upside down. And you're burying it about that deep, 16 to 18 inches. We don't do a lot of moldboard plowing anymore. We still do some. We do more chisel plowing today. So this is a chisel plow. And a chisel plow is kind of a really small one that's going really deep. What they're going to do is they're not going to flip the soil. They're going to stir it. And what they're trying to do is, of the old dead crop residue, they're trying to leave 30 to 40% of it on the surface. And the reason is to reduce water erosion, wind erosion, the rate that soil is lost from the land. That's why the impetus of chisel plowing. Of course, we could no-till plow too. That's a different kind of thing. So that often happens in the fall. If farmers get behind in the fall because we end up with a late growing season, a cool growing season, and it's really wet, they may not be able to do that plowing in the fall, and then they'll do it in the spring. They don't want to do it in the spring if they can avoid it, because spring gets really, really busy. It's critically important to plant your seeds early to maximize how much light you can capture by your crop plants in May, June, and July before you get into the drought stress times of usually July and August. So we know, farmers know, the earlier they can plant and not have their plants killed by a frost, the higher the yield they get. And so they're just trying to reduce the workload in the spring by plowing in the fall. And the same is true with fertilizer. So some fall fertilization. So when we talk about fertilization, we're fertilizing with a number of different things. The number one element that plants need and need the most of is nitrogen. So it's nitrogen that makes up the nucleotides of DNA in our bodies. It's nitrogen that is primary to the amino acids that make up the proteins in our bodies. And so plants, just like animals, they need a lot of protein. They need a lot of nucleotides for their DNA. And so they use a lot of nitrogen. So the nitrogen is not here. We don't typically put the nitrogen on in the fall, although farmers used to. They know that if they put the nitrogen on in the fall, most of it's going to get lost. It's going to get washed away by water. And so the crop actually won't get it. And turns out nitrogen is easily the most expensive fertilizer. But they will put on phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, lime in the fall. So this is a lime truck going down through the field. When we grow crops and we use a lot of nitrogen, we tend to acidify those soils. And so you have to counteract the effect of nitrogen acidifying soils with lime. And it turns out plants take up a ton of calcium and magnesium. I thought when you were going to talk about milk that you were thinking, I got to drink the milk to get the calcium. But it turns out there is more available calcium in vegetables than there is in milk. What happens, there's a lot of calcium in milk, but there's also a lot of protein in milk. And so when our body takes in both the calcium and the protein of milk, the proteins tend to acidify the serum in our blood, which the calcium is then used to neutralize. And so most of the calcium that we get in milk, we pee out because of that. So it turns out, yeah, plants, they consume a ton of calcium. And so you can get all the calcium you need, and more of it's available actually by eating vegetables than by eating something like milk. And there are reasons why farmers know that if they apply more nutrients, they're going to get yield increases. They also know that there's an upper threshold. They know that plants are going to take up more nitrogen when the plant gets big. That should kind of make sense to you. Small plants don't need that much nutrient, nitrogen or calcium and magnesium, but you get a big plant. I mean, think of it as terms of people. When you got a little kid, they don't eat as much. When you got a big kid, they need a lot more. And so, you know, imagine you're putting these fertilizers on in the fall, and the big plants aren't actually going to be out there until July and August. So when I put this stuff on in the fall, those nutrients are going to lay on the soil surface, or they might be incorporated in the top few inches for like months before anything's growing there. Well, what happens in most of our climates, like Michigan, during that period of time? It rains. And so those nutrients are eluted away. And so we lose a lot of it. So I get why farmers put it on early, but it comes with a cost, right? The inefficiency cost. So this is nitrogen. Most of nitrogen is put on in the spring. You've probably seen these white tanks out in the fields before, I'm guessing. Have you noticed them? Do you know what's in them? It's nitrogen. Do you know what form of nitrogen's in them? It's ammonia. And it says, it might say, I don't see it, it's good memory, but, oh, okay, it's up on top. So it's ammonia. So if I ask my college kids this, they don't know how to answer it. Have you ever used ammonia in your kitchen? Because college kids these days, none of them have. They don't even know what ammonia is. What did you use it in your kitchen for? Cleaning. Clean. How does it clean? What does ammonia do? It what? It eats away. Ammonia eats away. It's a sterilant. So ammonia has a pH of 14. So it's as alkaline can be. So if you have a bacterial body, a little bacterial cell, and you expose it to ammonia, it will kill them outright. Fungal spores, any kind of disease organism, which is why we use it as a sterilant. And how much ammonia do you need? Not much. So my mom used to use ammonia, and it was like a tablespoon in a bucket, just a tablespoon of ammonia. So farmers are going to put ammonia in their soil, and they're going to put it about 8 to 10 inches deep. So there's like a little tube. There's a big tube that goes from this tank right here. So the ammonia is going to be liquid ammonia, is going to go through that tube. It's going to spread out, and there's a tube going underneath each one of those tines. And so as the tractor is moving through the field, they're going to dribble ammonia in the soil about that deep throughout the whole field. Farmers have to put ammonia on 2 weeks before they're going to plant their crop. Do you know why? It would kill the crop. So they have to put ammonia in the soil. They have to put it deep because ammonia is NH3, it will react immediately with water to make NH4 plus ammonium ion, which can then be tied to soil colloids in the soil. It'll be held through an electrochemical bond because soil particles are negatively charged and ammonium ion is positively charged. So generally, most of the nitrogen that farmer is going to put in will hang around in the soil for at least a period of time, but gradually it's going to let go from the soil particles. It's going to convert to nitrate ammonia, which then can be leached away if it rains a lot. Farmers know that if they apply more nitrogen on the y-axis from 0 to 250, that they will get generally more yield. So this line's like a regression line. What do you notice about the dots? Each of those dots is a different experiment where Michigan State Extension, for example, was doing like a dose response study. They would apply different amounts of nitrogen and they would see what yield they got. So what do you notice? They're scattered all over the place. So it turns out, oftentimes, when a farmer puts nitrogen in the soil, they know that the crop is only going to get maybe 30 or 40% of it. Okay, I learned a trick, and that is, but I walk around and move too much. If I pin it down with the glasses, then it holds better. Sort of. And yeah, I could take it off my arm. So yeah, there it goes. So it turns out of the nitrogen that farmers apply, plants don't actually get a lot of it. If I take that off, actually that's got a tighter. Yeah, maybe I will. Okay. This is probably easier than I can wander around, cause trouble. So it turns out weather patterns are critically important. Some years, if you have a warmer, wetter year, organic matter in soils, kind of the material, they partially decomposed plants from previous years, it mineralizes, and when it mineralizes, it releases nitrogen naturally. And so what you're kind of seeing are years where there's big responses, high yield responses to however much nitrogen was added. Those are probably hot, dry years. And so the thing is, a farmer's got to put nitrogen on in March. If a farmer knew what the weather pattern was going to be in July, they could put more or less on, but you never know what the weather is going to be in the like 3 months from then. So if you were a farmer, what would you do? You put on the maximum amount that you can get a response from and have all your bases covered, realizing that lots of years you've just spread a whole bunch of nitrogen and you spend a lot of money for that nitrogen and you probably aren't going to get any yield response from it. But you never know which years you are or are not going to get the response. So you've got to cover your bases. It's risk management. Because they've got lots of other expenses in seed and land. And so they're going to use the nitrogen. They're just going to apply however much they need. So generally, farmers are going to put on typically 200 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre for corn. Soybeans, probably very little, if any, because soybeans a nitrogen fixing plant. It'll make its own biologically available nitrogen. So there's a smaller planter. That's I think that's a 16 row planter. So very commonly now we'll see 24, even 36 row planters. And so you can, with a planter, drive about 10 miles an hour through the field to plant. Actually shouldn't drive that fast, but they do. It should be more like 7 or 8. And so you can plant a lot of acres really, really fast. They will apply pesticides, as you're probably aware. And one of the pesticides that they apply are what are called herbicides. And so herbicides kill all the little weeds that are going to compete with your crop plants for light, and water, and nitrogen. So you want to have your crop plants get the resources it needs. You don't necessarily want to feed the weeds. And so this is a little bit some of that annual or seasonal variability as well. Some years there could be a 12 to 15% loss if you don't use an herbicide. And other years it could be 35 or 40% yield losses if you don't use an herbicide. Of course, you never know what years those are in advance. So you're going to apply the herbicides that you need to control the weeds for the worst case scenarios. Primary weeds, herbicides that we use are kind of interesting. Increasingly glyphosate. So we have Roundup Ready corn, Roundup Ready soybeans. Turns out Roundup used to be a crappy herbicide because it killed everything green. And then there was a gene identified from a bacterium that had been treated regularly with glyphosate, developed resistance, able to take that gene out of the bacterium, splice it into the genome of corn and of soybean and canola and of cotton. Pretty much every crop type now has a Roundup Ready resistance gene in it, which then allows you to spray Roundup. It allows you to spray Roundup on your crop plant. It will kill all the weeds because it kills everything green except your crop plant. So it went overnight from being the worst possible herbicide to being like the best possible herbicide. It's selective for, it's killing everything, but it's totally selective for your one crop. 2,4-D is probably an herbicide that you know. How many of you have used it? Weed and feed. So yes, it kills broadleaves, and it turns out it really kills dandelions and poison ivy very effectively. So if you buy any weed and feed fertilizer and put it on your lawn, you're using 2,4-D. So 2,4-D turns out to be closely related to another chemical. So 2,4-D is 2,4-dichloral acid. How many of you have heard of 2,4,5-T? 2,4,5-trichloral acid, otherwise known as Agent Orange. Heard of that one, huh? So very close. Now, 2,4-D is thought to be pretty safe for humans. Atrazine is, up until recently, the #1 herbicide in corn. So atrazine is an interesting herbicide because it would kill grasses, but not corn, which is a grass, which made it an ideal chemical for farmers growing corn. So if you take atrazine and you mix it with 2,4-D, you can kill all the broadleaf weeds and you kill all the grass weeds, but not corn. Well, it turns out atrazine is an endocrine disruptor. So it takes testosterone in people and it converts it to estrogen, which for women is not a big deal. For men, it's probably a concern, and it's active at in the parts per trillion range. And so I can go out and collect water samples out of Lake Michigan, and I can identify, I can measure atrazine. Metolachlor is not really used much anymore. It was used kind of like 2,4-D was. And then gramoxone's been in the news lately. So gramoxone has a trade name called paraquat. It's a burn down chemistry. So if you spray it on anything green, it will kill those plants just outright real fast. So farmers growing something like cotton will use that because they can kill the leaves, and then the cotton bolls will go ahead and ripen, and then all those green and growing leaves don't get in the way of your harvesting the cotton balls at the end of the growing season. So increasingly people will use paraquat on soybeans, and they'll grow a fuller season soybean that gives high yield potential. And then when about a week before they need to harvest, they'll spray it with gramoxone. And so now gramoxone's been in the news because it's being identified as a clear cancer causer. So insect control, farmers use insecticides if they need them. Turns out a lot of cases in corn and soybeans, they don't. There is this kind of thing, I'll talk a little bit more about integrated pest management, where farmers are becoming more astute at figuring out how many bugs they've got, what kinds of bugs, and doing a better job of calculating economic threshold of whether it's economically feasible to spray with an insecticide or a fungicide or not. So that's the production cycle. How about we produce a lot of food. We do produce a lot of food. And so over the last 50, 60 years, since the 1940s, genetics have changed a ton. We have just continued to improve each kind of different kind of crop line, if you will. We're making hybrids out of most crops these days. So we've got a couple of tools. We can use just breeding with some crops like corn, which has a male tassel and a female silk. So you can kind of detassel the females so they don't self-pollinate. You can drive pollination from a desired male to a female. But there is also a kind of a process called cytoplasmic male sterility, which you can chemically use to make hybrids, enforce a cross-pollination one way or the other. Increasingly mechanization. So I kind of showed you the picture of the tractor and the different kinds of tools that you can use to apply herbicides. That allows people to do some things that they could never do anything with before. Fertilization, just the access to fertilizer changed dramatically after World War II. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Pest control. We actually don't apply as much active ingredient of pesticides as we used to. That's probably a good thing. On the other hand, the active ingredients are much, much more lethal to the insects. So FDA, or not FDA, EPA is test safety of these things, but you don't know what you don't know. And then agronomics, just knowing better when to plant, how early to plant is all kind of continued to improve. So this is acres. Turns out 75% of crop acres in the United States is planted with corn and soybean. So 3/4 of agricultural areas devoted to those two crops. And so it's the tune of roughly 94 million acres of corn will be planted in the United States each year, and something on the order of 87 to 90 million acres of soybeans, and another 40 million acres or so of wheat. Yes.
Do we have a shortage of land to plant those things?
We have a shortage of land? Not at the moment, probably. But it is a concern of mine anyway, because if you think about any Midwestern city, where do they grow out onto? It's always agricultural land. So it turns out if you're going to build a subdivision, you're going to get land that's already cleared, that's already flat. It's easier to build roads and build houses on.
And solar farms?
Yep. So plants are solar engines too, but turns out plants are not as efficient as solar panels are, which I find as a plant physiologist very disturbing. Yes. No, go ahead.
Okay. What I've been reading about is because we plant so much corn, soybeans, and wheat, we have globally decreased diversity, which means that if something were to come along that was to impact the amount of corn or wheat or soybeans that we're growing, that's going to impact the access to food globally.
Yes. I'm going to go there later on. So you're stealing the thunder a little bit, but I will say to help to illustrate your point, the monarch butterfly. You're familiar with the monarch butterfly? You're aware that it's on the endangered list now. Do you know why it's on the endangered list? Because it's access to milkweed. So where does monarchs come from in the spring? Mexico. And they have to go back to Mexico in the fall. And monarchs are a butterfly. They are pretty amazing flyers, but they've got to fly through what states? If the monarch's in Michigan, there are plenty of milkweeds in Michigan, especially along the lakeshore, which is why they hit the lakeshore so hard in the fall. They have to fly through Indiana and Illinois and Iowa and Arkansas and Louisiana, where we have wall-to-wall corn and soybeans. And where farmers are using pesticides to control milkweeds. So when farmers talk about controlling milkweeds, they mean killing them. Because milkweeds growing in a soybean field compete with light for the soybeans. So you're right. Habitat loss, the number one cause of species extinctions is habitat loss. And agriculture is the number one cause of habitat loss.
There was something on the news about the monarchs and was showing them, and experts say that it's a 4-generation butterfly, because the one that flies there is not the one that comes back.
Yeah, 4 generations. Turns out the 4th generation makes the entire flight from like here all the way to Mexico. They actually changed their wing structure in those generations. It's the spring generations that are coming through the US Midwest that don't have the milkweeds because farmers have controlled them with pesticides. Yeah.
With the industrialization of farming, are a lot more acres of land used for farming now? Because they buy out everything. And
Actually, not. A little bit to his point back there, the amount of acres actually planted to crops has declined slightly because we're urbanizing gradually into agricultural areas at the tune of something on the order of a couple of % or so a year. So yeah, it turns out agricultural land at some point in time is going to be a problem, but so far food in grocery stores is still pretty cheap and nobody wants to mess with that system. So there aren't restrictions on how we develop agricultural land in the United States like there are in European countries. In European countries, we used to live in France, and you cannot convert an agricultural field to a housing complex in France without jumping through incredible number of hoops, if it's even allowed or possible.
You're talking about all these chemicals and pesticides and so forth, and they're used around the world.
Mhm.
Are they produced in the United States, most of them, or does every country produce their own fertilizers and so forth?
So
They depend on us.
they're produced around the world. So it turns out a lot of the fertilizers, potassium, for example, that's coming from South America. So we don't really produce it here. A bunch of it's coming out of Canada. There's a lot of potassium produced in Canada. In terms of agricultural chemicals, they're produced in the United States. They're produced in Europe. There are factories, plants that produce them in Argentina and in Brazil as well. So they're produced multiple places, but they're all produced by, a handful of companies. So I work for Syngenta, and so Syngenta's corporate headquarters was Basel, Switzerland. And turns out BASF, the only exception is DuPont. They're all European companies that came out of the German war machine.
So maybe we're in need of their production.
Yeah. So to avoid some of the shipping costs, things are produced in all different places.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, more seeds that we plant here, agriculture, that are produced here, just because of the volume of seeds and the shipping cost. But we use North American companies. Working with Syngenta, we used Brazil and we used Chile to produce seeds for here during their summer, which would be our winter. Especially new genetics that we're trying to speed to the marketplace.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's a global system.
Yeah.
All right, keep going. Probably speed up a little bit because there's stuff that we want to get to yet today. Corn and soybeans we use for feed, fuel, and food. In that order. Most of it goes for feed. Some of it goes for fuel, ethanol, case of corn, diesel in the case of soybean oil, and food is less than 5%, actually. So you don't consume very much corn or soybean directly, especially if you don't eat a lot of ultra processed foods. Wheat and rice, mostly food. So wheat's grown mostly Kansas, the Dakotas, Montana. Rice is grown mostly Arkansas, Louisiana, and the Delta of California. And then cotton and canola are a couple of the other more major crops. So cotton, think Arkansas and South, in a little bit of the Carolinas, but it's mostly moved out of the Carolinas. Fair bit of cotton is grown in Arizona, and it is a water-loving crop. And it turns out most of the agricultural land in which cotton is grown in Arizona is not owned or operated by the United States or manufactured of the United States. Canola is more of the Dakotas. So think North Dakota and then Canada, Saskatchewan, Manitoba is where you tend to find canola. Does that little plant look familiar to you? You might have seen it as a weed growing this spring along the sides of roads. It's also called yellow rocket. So we in this part of the world, as a farmer, you would spray 2,4-D to kill yellow rocket or canola because it's a weed. Definition of a weed is any plant growing where you don't want it to be. That is the definition of a weed. Kind of crazy, but actually it makes sense if you think about it. So you want canola growing in a canola field, but you don't want canola growing in a soybean field because it's going to take light and water and nutrients that your soybean plants aren't going to get. CAFOs. You know that term? You say yes, no. Okay, if I spell it out and it's up here, confined animal feeding operation. So I learned about CAFOs when I worked as an agronomist, kind of was winding down at Syngenta because they were painted on big rocks in Iowa, no CAFOs. And now we are entirely CAFO system, almost entirely a CAFO system. It's the industrialization of animal culture. So I pointed out, we've got monocultures of corn and soybean to the tune of like 180 million acres in the United States alone. But if we talk about eggs or broiler chickens or turkeys or hogs, hams, these are also monocultures. And it turns out mostly the people who grow animals for us to eat, chickens, eggs, dairy, hams, they're growing, that's what they do. They only grow animals and they do not grow any crops. So one animal kind and age concentrated in as a monoculture to enhance production efficiency. Some reasons to do that. Factors driving CAFO growth, low cost feed, selective animal breeding, highly specialized and inexpensive systems. So you can grow a lot of food that way with very little human labor. Factory farms. Yeah, that's another way of saying CAFO. So here's why CAFOs persist. And this is why almost most of your animal products come with CAFOs. Next.
So most animal feeding don't grow their own corn or hay or whatever.
Correct. You either are a crop farmer or you're an animal farmer. It didn't used to be like that. Now I'm going to go kind of the next unit. I'll kind of walk you through when this changed. But it's not like that anymore. I mean, some do it, but low scale in terms of the overall amount of meat that we produce. So here's why CAFOs work. It basically, it's if you grow animals in a CAFO, they're going to use a lot less feed than if you grow them free range. And if you think about it, it'll make sense. So it takes, for beef, if I grow beef in a feedlot, it's going to take 7 to 8 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat. If I let those cows roam around out in the field, it's going to take 15 to 16 pounds of grain or calorie equivalent to produce a pound of beef. And the ratios are pretty much similar with whatever meat type we're talking about. Pork, it's going to take 4 pounds of grain in a CAFO to produce a pound of pork. But if it's free range, it's going to be 8 to 9 pounds. So why is it? Why do CAFOs need so much less grain, like half, to produce a pound of meat? The animals are confined. So if an animal's confined, what can't it do?
It doesn't move around. It doesn't use energy.
Yeah, it doesn't use energy to move around. So if I sit on the couch at home and don't eat, because maybe I had a hip replaced in January, the amount of food that I ate went way down, because if it didn't go way down, I was going to gain weight real fast. And now that I'm running and riding my bike, although sometimes there are downsides to that, I eat almost twice as, I eat a third more calories per day. Just to maintain my body weight. And so it's just a matter of animals getting exercise. Oops. It's a matter of animals getting exercise and not getting exercise. And if an animal doesn't get exercise, think about the quality of the meat. What character of the meat changes with an animal not getting exercise? It's probably tougher if you cook it too long. It can be too tough. But I think I heard it over here. There's more fat in the meat. Yeah, there's more fat in the meat itself. So we kind of like that in a way. How many of you would like to have a nice dry steak? How many of you would like to have a nice juicy steak? What makes the juice in a steak? It's the saturated fat. So, but if you're after protein, okay, if you're after protein, you actually want lean meat. So I would want an exercising cow, not a non-exercising cow. But you got to be careful how you cook it. You can't overcook them or they will be dry as shoe leather. So I don't eat cows or pigs anymore, but I eat venison. And so venison is very lean. And you can cook it in a way, because that's the way I can eat red meat and avoid a lot of the saturated fat that I would otherwise get from cows or animals being produced in CAFOs. So this is what cows look like in a CAFO. So this is a big dairy barn. And this is Swiss Lane Farms, which is kind of by Caledonia, Alto. They give you tours, by the way, if you want to go there and see their operation. Let me know. I'll set you up with Annie Link. It's a great tour, and she does a nice job. They have a robotic milker. So the cows will on their own decide when they want to get milked. They get a little treat, and then there's a robot that milks them 2 to 4 times a day. Or if you're talking about beef, typically a cow-calf operation will be out in the pasture when the cows are pregnant. They're going to be artificially inseminated. You might have a bull, but they're for cleanup. People don't want bulls around too much because they're dangerous. So they're all artificially inseminated. And when they are out there, after they're out there for about 6 months, then they're going to go into a feedlot, which you've probably seen. If you drive along I-80 to Colorado, you see a bunch of them. And they'll be in a feedlot for somewhere between 90 and 100 days. And in the feedlot, they're going to get fed silage and corn grain. They can't be in the feedlot for more than 100 days because they'll get sick. These are ruminant animals. They're used to a lot of fiber in their diet. And when you feed them grain, after 120 days, they get sick and they die. And so they're in there long enough to be eating the grain to fatten up, but not so long to get acidosis and die, because then they can't be sold. Pigs are usually held in familial groups through the different age classes. So this is a farrowing pen. So these are the mother pigs and the babies. They're held separate so that the mother won't crush the babies in the concrete floor. And then they're kept in their various age classes, usually as familial groups, until the point of 200 pounds. And 220 pounds are considered market weight. And then off to the slaughterhouse they go. Eggs. So Herbrook Farms down in Saranac, for example, these are the sorts of operations that they have. There's a hen, each with their own cage, and then they lay their eggs. Their eggs roll onto a conveyor and they're carried out where they're effectively candled, washed, and then sold. As opposed to free range chickens, which are running around and burning needless energy, getting exercise, as opposed to turkeys for meat. Well, chickens, these are the turkeys and these are the chickens. And so typically you'll have several thousand, if not 10 or 20,000 birds in a barn. And this is a highly integrated system. So each of those birds is a clone. They're genetically identical to one another. And they're so close that partly they can move around and go to feed and water, but they don't get too much exercise. There are some advantages to capos. So it would be wrong if I didn't tell you what some of the advantages are. First of all, the feed conversion ratio, right? That's a pretty significant advantage. Imagine if we went all free range, you're going to have to double the number of acres of corn and soybean production. And we don't have those acres, to a little bit your question, because that's the only way to feed enough animals to feed an American public that wants meat in their diet. That's one advantage. But another advantage, you can go to Coopersville, and there's a dairy not far off I-96. Yeah, I-96. And they have a manure lagoon. So these are the dairy barns. The cows are in there. The waste from those cows goes into a pit, which is doubly redundant in case of like a big rainfall to not have a spill. Because imagine if you put that much manure in a natural stream or lake, it will kill everything. And then what they do is they put a kind of a big tarp over the top of it and they seal it. And what they're doing is they're letting the decomposition in that manure lagoon occur, and you create biogas pressurized on the top. So biogas is methane, which is effectively natural gas. And so they use it as a fuel. So the Coopersville dairy operates on electricity that they produce. They actually produce excess electricity that they put into the consumer's power grid. So they are off the grid. Well, they're not off the grid, but they're generating more power for the grid than they're taking away. So that's an advantage. If you have free range, you can't do that.
So what's the effect on the environment of burning methane?
Well, it's, when you burn methane, it's going to create some heat, and you're going to use the heat to power a turbine, but there is waste heat. On the other hand, if you don't burn the ammonia is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. I'll actually give you some numbers about that in a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, it's going to actually be next week, probably, looking at the time.
So, so what I'm seeing here is really very profit oriented.
Yes,
And-
ma'am. Oh, yes, ma'am.
And, I'll just tell a little bit of my experience. I had a friend who raised buffalo, and he was, the animals were used to him. He did have pasture land. He said, why am I buying grain when the meat is actually better being grass fed? When it was time to call one of the animals, he made sure that it was in a pen with another of his brethren. And so the animal was never stressed. The quality of the meat was wonderful, and it was much more humane.
So stay tuned for next week. Gregarious animals do, as you kind of point out with buffalo, animals of these types all tend to be gregarious. Cows are very social. They like their brothers and their sisters, and they hang out with a particular animal or two around the clock. And so, for animals to be together in a pen is not necessarily stressful to the animals. If they're typically semi-sterile, they're typically healthier animals in free range because they usually have a veterinarian watching over them. I know there's another point coming here. Cows tend to be milked 2 or more times a day, and they can get milked whenever they want to get milked in a robotic dairy. But at the same time, when you put that many animals in a pen together, and if there's a disease outbreak, think bird flu and what happened to your egg prices, what happens? If one bird within a flock of 30,000 gets bird flu, you've got to kill all 30,000 birds. Because, well, how many of you were college students that lived in a dorm? Is a dorm a little bit like a CAFO? And so, we know as professors, the students all come in, in the summer, and there's usually a little outbreak of something that happens in September, not too bad. And then we go through the semester, and then all the kids go home for Thanksgiving. And then what happens during the exam 2 weeks after Thanksgiving? Everyone gets sick because one or two come in with the influenza or something like that, and they spread it like crazy among the people in the dorms. So something similar is happening here.
Just as an aside here, if you're a farmer who has an egg farm,
Mhm.
and I mean a chicken farm,
Yep.
and he's raising them for eggs, and you have such a massive amount of livestock, if you want to call it that die. How do they get rid of that? Do they have massive incinerators? Do they bury them? Or,
I think
mean,
what Herb Brooks did is with the FDA watching them, they buried their chickens. They had to bury them in plastic or rubber enclosed container. I want to say they had to go like 10 feet deep because of the bird flu just fairly recently. Herb Brooks lost, I think, 75% of their egg laying capacity in a period of like a few weeks. And so they literally buried them in like 10 feet deep. Yeah, sure. So there's some risks, right? If you're farming one crop, that means all your risk is on that one crop.
The replacement animals.
Well, I'm not sure where Herb Brooks necessarily gets them, but I know what Tyson, they just have a whole group of chickens that are egg laying chickens that are of a particular breed that they've been breeding for some time. And so you got to produce, you got to hatch the eggs and you got to grow those little chickens up into egg laying age. And that's a little bit why your egg prices were high for a period of months, because it takes a few months of growing up the hens to be old enough, mature enough to be able to start laying eggs again. So here's a big concern, and this is not exactly where you were thinking, but this is antibiotics in livestock. Part of the reason the animals are healthier in these CAFOs is, I mentioned, they have their own veterinarians, and so they're using a lot of vaccines on birds. There's a bird flu vaccine for birds, and they're using a lot of antibiotics in the case of bacterial disease. So it turns out there is, of the amount of antibiotics used in the United States, the kinds of antibiotics that people would use, the same antibiotics are given to animals, or livestock animals. And about 60% of the total supply of antibiotics in the United States is actually used in livestock farming. And so the risk then is, if there is a lot of antibiotic exposure to vertebrate animals, that if bacteria become resistant to those antibiotics and those resistant bacteria make their way to other vertebrate animals, people, that we could, by overusing antibiotics in livestock, make those antibiotics not very helpful for people. And so there's actually very good evidence that this is going on. There are two classes of antibiotics that are not used in animal agriculture, but most are. So the concern of resistant bacteria, antibiotic resistant bacteria that are developed in livestock and make their way into the human food system or into humans directly is concerning. So there are reasons to CAFO, and there are reasons not to CAFO. How did we get to where we are? So I'm going to go kind of quick because we only got like 7 minutes left. We have had tremendous amounts of farm consolidation. So the number of farms has gone down and the average farm size has gone up. The number of acres that we farm has remained roughly the same. That's what this little graph shows. And so this is my mom's childhood farm. Grew up in Etna, Michigan. It's kind of near McBain, if you know where McBain is. And my mom was one of 6 kids. It was a highly integrated farm. They had cows, they had pigs. There was a dairy farm. They had like 12 dairy cows. That was the full-size dairy farm. They had a few pigs to eat. They had some chickens for eggs, and they would eat the chickens. They grew corn, beans of different kinds, no soybeans, oats, wheat, alfalfa, grass, hay, and more. They also grew peanuts and they grew cucumbers and they grew potatoes that they sold as a cash crop. So my mom talks about how she picked all those things. They were small fields, wooded hedgerows, 5 to 7 crop rotations. So talking about Leviticus crop rotation, they were doing it. They were doing 5 to 7 crop rotations where one of those rotations was alfalfa, and an alfalfa stand would stay in place for like 3 years. So every 10 years, with the exception of the 3 years of alfalfa, it was a different crop. Large families, labor intensive. So genetics changed. We've talked a little bit, some of these things. We've bred crops for yield, not quality. We've got higher yielding hybrids replacing open pollinated varieties. Talked about hybridization just briefly. We have a very narrow corn germplasm base. We kind of use all yellow number 2 dents. Flints would be Indian corn and maybe popcorn is a flint. Those are fairly high in protein content, but yellow dent yields more volume. So we've gone entirely as an industry to yellow dent. There are 3 parental lines that comprise really all of the genetics planted in the world. Mo 73, B73, stiff stalk, and iodent. And mostly it's Mo 73 and B73. Mo is Missouri. Pest management's changed. So we've gone from nitrogen fertilizer from munitions plants, World War II. If you want to read a really good book, Alchemy of Air, talks about the German war machine and how they developed a plant to create ammonia from which to create explosives, which was important for Germany because they did not have access to saltpeter. And that allowed World War I and especially World War II to happen. Otherwise, Germany wouldn't have been able to fight. Pesticides from World War II replaced tillage. We used DDT on lice, 2,4-D came out of the war machine, atrazine came out of the war machine. And there's others that did too, but those are the biggies that we talked about. We've mechanized extensively. We used to use animals, and now we use, and people. So the only reason corn has one big ear is because it was bred to have one big ear, that people were hand picking it. Native corn has somewhere between the order of like 15 to 18 ears, each with like 3 or 4 kernels on an ear. So imagine how much labor it would take to pick that by hand. Well, now we use, of course, combines and we thresh it out. And a combine does kind of one thing at a time and does it pretty well. Then we have my job as a Syngenta agronomist. So this is kind of what I saw. It was the mantra, get big or get out. And it was all driven by economics. You had to get big. You had to leverage equipment that was expensive and specialized. And the only way you could make those economics work is if you increase the amount of land that you farmed. And you had to focus on one kind of crop or fewer kinds of crops. So it specialized, it was shrinking. Now it was less than 5% farmers by the 90s. And specialized, so you'd spend all your money getting the specialized equipment to grow like one kind of thing. There's more cash rented land. It turns out like a third of Iowa is not actually owned by people in the United States. It's owned by investors from other countries. And they have banks with agronomists who organize the farming of that land as cash rent. So technology changed. We have GPS and GIS. We have precision livestock genetics. You don't need to breed a whole bunch of Holstein cows just to produce males and females. You can take the sperm from a bull and you can spin it in a centrifuge, and you take the sperms off the bottom because they're X, not Y. Then you can cross that with the female cow's egg and you can do IVM. That's how pretty much all your dairy cows are produced these days, because dairy cow bulls are a waste of effort. Nobody wants a dairy cow that's a bull because they don't produce milk. So chemical companies bought out seed companies. This is where the GMOs came into play. This all happened when I was there. So Basically Monsanto bought DeKalb Holden, Syngenta bought Funks, Northrop King, Golden Harvest Garst. That's who I worked for. DuPont bought Pioneer and now Asgrow. And basically 94% of the US corn crop and soybean crop are GMO. That's mostly what's grown these days. And so we've gone to highly consolidated and specialized farms with complex and expensive systems. They're specialized in one crop, eggs or broilers or corn and soybeans. Never more than one, because there's too much cost in getting the specialized equipment to be able to do more than one thing. There's a lot of vertical integration, so farm to consumer, but I'm not talking farmers markets here. I'm talking about like Tyson. Tyson contracts broilers. So a farmer receives chicks and feed from Tyson. These are genetically modified chicks to be exactly genetically the same, and they're fed exactly the same diet. So they know that if the farmer puts the Tyson chicks and feeds the Tyson feed in 28 to 38 days, every bird will be precisely the same size and shape. So you can literally go in at night, empty out the barn, bring those birds directly to a factory and literally put them on a hook and do piecework down the line. Every bird is exactly the same size. They're genetically identical. ConAgra's Healthy Choice Meals. ConAgra is doing kind of the same thing. So talk about Healthy Choice Meals. ConAgra is contracting specific corn genetics with specific farmers. And they are typically owned by ConAgra. And by doing this, you can take out all the middlemen and you can consolidate the profits within one company. Almost done. So what we haven't gotten to yet is the environmental impacts of crop production. It's not pretty. We'll talk briefly about what sustainable ag is, how sustainable ag is trying to reduce some of those environmental impacts. But I'll also say that because we're heavily vested in monoculture systems, there is a very big limit to what sustainable ag can do. I think we need to reform the system. I think we need to think about a whole different model. And that's where agroecology will come in next week. Cool.
Look forward to seeing you a week from today.
Yeah.
And the subject will be introduced agroecology, ecological principles applied to the management of food systems and agriculture as a better alternative to our present agriculture. So we'll look forward to that.
Yep.
Thank you again.
Yeah.